Hey guys, I'm here to introduce today's chapel speaker, our own Mr. Smith. Other than having the most interesting stories about life and more Milo sweet tea in his room than any other person I've ever met, Mr. Smith is a pretty cool person. After graduating magna cum laude from Vanderbilt, go Doors, with a degree in mechanical engineering, Mr. Smith married his college sweetheart and joined the U.S. Navy as a submarine officer. After 20 years in the Navy, he began to teach both math and physics, which he has done in Memphis, Murfreesboro, and all over Florida. Finally, in 2020, we were blessed with Mr. Smith's presence here at Baylor. He teaches Algebra 1, Pre-Calc, and Physics, and I've been lucky enough to have him the past 2 years. Since he's been gatekeeping the topic of this talk from everyone who's asked him what he's talking about since I approached him about speaking in chapel, I'll stop talking right now, and everyone, let's give a big red welcome to Mr. Smith.
I had to put on my ball cap after I left my mom because she would take it off my head because you're not allowed to wear hats in chapel. My mom and my wife are here, so say hello to them at lunch today. Yay! Before I start my speech proper, I would like to talk about your senior speeches. I have been really impressed with all the senior speeches. I admire your stories, your ability and your willingness to take on difficult topics. I think you're very courageous. And if I do half as good as you guys did today, then I'll be happy. Since I'm now over 60, and I didn't get a chance to give a senior speech when I was in high school, I'm thinking about this as my senior speech. So there you go. Last summer, Chaplain Gallimore asked me to speak at chapel this year. He had heard from a former student, I think it was Addison, that I tell a lot of stories and that I genuinely seem to love my students. He asked me to talk about how I came to teaching from being a nuclear submarine officer. Now, a lot of people have asked me if I'm nervous the last few days, and I'm not afraid of speaking in front of people. I've done a lot of that. But as I think back on those other talks, particularly to large groups, they always involve talking about ideas that I knew something about, like speaking to an auditorium of submarine officers about the implementation of the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, or to a room full of teachers about the classical model of education. But frankly, this one makes me a little more nervous because it's so personal. You asked me about me. And there's some parts about this story that scare me to share. And I don't really like to share the story, but since you asked, okay. My first thought after you asked me was that I would just spend some time telling funny stories about the Navy and about teaching. And my students will probably tell you I have a lot of those. My friend and mentor, Carrie Rice, the middle school math teacher, told me she thought I must be about 106 years old. Because no one has that many stories in one lifetime. But that plan of mine increasingly began to look like the coward's way out, as it did not answer the question, how did I get from here to here? Or from here to here? So even if I don't want to talk about it, particularly to such a large group of my friends, I think there may be good reasons to do so. And here's why. During this season, when seniors are finding out about the next phase of their lives and juniors are in the throes of the college application process, I hope to show you that sometimes not getting what you really, really want can be a really, really good thing. I hope this is not a curse on your college application process. Everyone in my family knows my favorite all-time movie is It's a Wonderful Life. In the movie, the protagonist, George Bailey, really wants to travel the world and have adventures. During the course of the film, George doesn't get what he wants, but he gets a visit from his guardian angel who shows him how his life or how things could have been different. I won't go into the movie. You should really watch it. The point is that we don't always get a glimpse of what our lives might have been like if we had gotten what we really wanted. But like George Bailey, I think maybe I did. As I tell this story, I'll use the words me and I a lot, when I really should be saying we and us. No one accomplishes very much by themselves, and I have had the best partner imaginable. My wife and I met in college and have been married for over 40 years. In the early years of our marriage, I felt as if I was the center of our family solar system. Over time, I changed my way of thinking and began to see us more like twin stars orbiting one another, with our children making up our planetary system. Now, as I look back over the last 40 years, I realize that I was at best a gas giant like Jupiter or Saturn. Our entire family, me included, clearly orbits around her. And even if I was thousands of miles away and hundreds of feet underwater, she was the one who always pulled me back and gave the thing that is us stability. Please come by and meet her at lunch and my mom today. But you asked me here today to explain how I came from being a Navy submarine officer to teaching high school math and physics. The short answer is that during my last year in the Navy, I was given the opportunity to substitute teach math and physics at my older two sons' small, very private school in Memphis, Tennessee, when their teacher became very ill. And that made me fall in love with teaching. But the rest of the story is a little deeper, like submarines. There's a lot of dad jokes here, I'm sorry. I guess I should start by explaining how I came to be a submarine officer in the first place. Sometimes I think I was always destined to be one. However, several issues conspired to me becoming a submarine officer. My father retired from the Navy when I was in the first grade. My father is one of the men in this photo. I think he's the one in the back, but my mother will correct me later if I'm wrong. This was taken above the Arctic Circle. My earliest memory is me standing beside him outside the barber shop on the Naval Air Station in Sanford, Florida, while he saluted the flag during evening colors. My father was a career enlisted sailor, so I grew up surrounded by Navy things. But by the time I was in sixth grade, I found that I was good in math. Took one of those standardized tests. But the deciding factor probably happened in Mrs. Copeland's 10th grade English class at Eastridge High School, about 10 miles that way. In that class, I wrote a research paper comparing and contrasting nuclear power and nuclear weapons. From that time on, I knew I wanted to be a nuclear submarine officer and eventually to command a submarine. I never lost that desire, and after high school, the Navy paid for me to go to college to study engineering. In college, I met and married my wife, and after college, we moved to Orlando, Florida for 6 months of nuclear power school, followed by another 6 months of training at a nuclear submarine prototype in upstate New York. I went through this year-long training, that's me over there. I went through this year-long training period in the company of about 30 or 40 other young officers. I'm the guy on the top row with the big forehead. And if you think I'm trying to make myself look glamorous, you should know that I consider myself to most closely resemble Goose from Top Gun. But my friend Scott, also on the back row, would have been more like Maverick. It's not like we were great friends like Mav and Goose, and Scott didn't kill me in a freak submarine accident. But when you spend a little over a year going through an academically rigorous program with someone, you become close enough. I bring up Scott for a more important reason. With one major exception, Scott and I had very similar careers. In fact, if you removed our names from our service records and mixed up the pages, even people who know us would have a hard time telling who did what. Right now, it's enough for this story just to introduce you to Scott. I'll come back to him a little later. After a little over a year of training, I began working on and with nuclear-powered submarines and would do so for a little over 20 years. However, right in the middle of my 20-year career, a wonderful and terrible thing happened. Wonderful for the world, but frankly, terrible for my career. Early in the late 80s and early 90s, the Soviet Union collapsed. The United States and our allies had been in conflict with the Soviets since the end of World War II in what came to be known as the Cold War. During this time, the single most important weapons platform in our combined arsenals was the submarine. With the collapse of the Soviet Union, the United States decided to save money by slowing the rate of production of new nuclear submarines, as well as starting an aggressive program to decommission older submarines. What this meant for me was a drastic cut in the selection rates for the two top jobs on each submarine, commanding officer and executive officer. The executive officer is the second in command. When I first joined the Navy in 1982, I was nearly guaranteed a command tour as long as I did not do anything terribly wrong. However, by the time I came up to selection for XO, or second in command, the selection rate for XO was around 50%. I made that cut, but there was another 50% selection rate for command. Thus, as I am sure all you math wizards in the audience will be able to tell me, my overall selection rate for command dropped from almost a sure thing to around 25%. I did not select for command. What I had wanted passionately since I was a teenager suddenly slipped away. This is where I need to bring my friend Scott back into the story. Remember that I told you our careers were very, very similar, with one major exception? Scott selected for command, while I did not. I later learned that Scott credits his selection for command to one job, and in particular to one boss he had in the Navy. This boss, a senior, well-respected captain, pulled some strings and got Scott's records cleaned up just enough for Scott to select for command. Interestingly, this captain should have been my boss. Remember that I told you how Scott and I had similar careers? At one point, I had orders as the initial Manning engineer officer on a brand new submarine, the USS Kentucky. However, the shipyard building Kentucky went on strike, and the Manning date slipped just enough for me to lose that position. And instead of reporting to the newest submarine in the fleet, I reported to the oldest, who ended up as engineer on Kentucky in my place. You've probably guessed it, my old friend Scott. And it was his second commanding officer on Kentucky, who, by the way, would have been my commanding officer, who Scott credits with getting him selected for command. When I first heard that, I thought, somebody up there really does not want me to go to command. But don't feel too bad for me. I had a really good career. I had an adventure. I did a lot of interesting things, went to a lot of interesting places, met heads of countries, had lunch with a president of a country. I sat in meetings in the back of the room with the U.S. Secretary of State and the U.S. Secretary of Defense, and I met a lot of other interesting people. I had an exciting career. I retired from the Navy after serving as second in command of a large shore-based command in Memphis, Tennessee. I had a big retirement ceremony, complete with speeches and a Navy brass band. My last commanding officer was on one side of me, and my first headmaster was on the other side. About a year before I retired, my friend Scott was in the news. Scott was in command of the submarine USS Greenville when a terrible accident occurred. Early one morning, off the coast of Oahu, Scott and the Greenville were practicing an emergency surfacing procedure called an emergency blow. This is one of the most exciting and potentially dangerous evolutions of submarine practices, and every sub practices it a few times a year. In this evolution, a submarine starts from very deep and uses high-pressure air to blow the water out of her ballast tanks, making her very buoyant. The submarine then puts on speed and drives itself to the surface. It doesn't break the surface that fast, about 30 miles an hour, but that's 300,000 tons of steel, and it's leaping out of the water. For you physics students, this equates to a lot of momentum, which during a collision would cause a lot of damage. When we do this for practice and not for a real emergency, Every submarine is required to make sure there are no other ships in the area that could be damaged. They do this by first coming to periscope depth and making a thorough sweep of the area. Scott and the Greenville made this sweep, but through a series of tragic errors, they misanalyzed a surface ship, thinking it was farther away than it really was. When Greenville surfaced, she did so right under a large Japanese commercial fishing ship, the Jaime Maru. The collision ripped the bottom out of the fisherman, which sank in minutes, killing 9 people. Scott was held responsible. And I am proud of the way Scott took responsibility on himself, trying to shield his crew as much as possible. He formally apologized to the Japanese people, and because they deemed it an accident, after a court-martial, Scott was allowed to retire. In fact, we retired within a few weeks of each other. But while I had a full retirement ceremony with speeches and a brass band, Scott had nothing. One day he was in the Navy, and the next day he was not. I felt terrible for Scott, but excited about my new job as a teacher in a small private school in Memphis. If I liked driving submarines, I found that I flat out loved teaching high school, particularly since I was able to have my own children as students. I'm currently in my 21st year of teaching, and for the first 16 of those years, I always had at least one of my 5 children as a student. These 5 children are very diverse, and I credit them and their classmates with teaching me how to be a good teacher. In the 90s, while I was still on active duty and before I started teaching, I took one of those personality tests and scored off the charts in empathy. Off the charts low. It was virtually undetectable. These early years in teaching, my children and their friends taught me how to be patient and kind. Through them, I learned that teaching is more familial than it is professional, more relational than it is transactional. It is less about the grade and more about the person. I'm almost done with my story, but I need to tie up a few loose ends. After teaching for 3 years in Memphis, my wife and I decided to move to Murfreesboro, Tennessee, to live with my father-in-law after his wife passed away. My new school in Murfreesboro was a member of TAIS, the same teaching organization Baylor hosted in a conference this last fall. TAIS also had a conference in the fall of my first year at my new school, and the conference just happened to have been held in Chattanooga that year also. Instead of Baylor, the conference was held at a hotel downtown. I knew that some former students of mine from my first school were attending UTC. Several of these students were former classmates of my second son, and I had not seen them since they had graduated the previous spring. I did not have any of their phone numbers because, well, that would be creepy. But I thought my son, who was a freshman at the University of Tennessee, might. I called him from the lobby of our hotel, and he gave me the number for one of the students whose name was Mary. I called Mary from the hotel lobby phone so as not to give her any hints about who might be calling. When she answered the phone, I said simply, "Hi, Mary." She responded immediately with an enthusiastic, "Coach Smith." She had recognized my voice. Oh yeah, I used to coach. We quickly set a time to meet with several other students the next day for lunch. I say quickly because I was having trouble breathing, let alone speaking. After hanging up, I sat in the lobby of that hotel in downtown Chattanooga and sobbed. I'm sure the people who passed me in the lobby thought I was a strange sight. And right now you may be thinking, neat story, Mr. Smith, but aren't you overreacting just a little? Sorry, I practiced this every day for the last 2 weeks, so I wouldn't do this. Maybe, but I have not told you everything. I left out an important detail or two. You see, the fishing vessel that Scott and the Greenville collided with and sank that day was not just a fisherman. It was also a floating high school. Students your age were working toward their high school diploma while at the same time training to become commercial fishermen. And 6 of the 9 people that died that morning were high school students, like you. And suddenly it hit me. I did not get what I had wanted deeply for almost 25 years. I had gotten much, much more. Eventually, I got you. And in the future, when you don't get what you really, really want, keep your chin up and remember, this might be a really, really good thing. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Smith, Commander Smith, for that beautiful and personal word. Thank you for being here. We're so glad you're a part of our community. You know, y'all, Mr. Smith is right. Sometimes we dream big and we reach for the stars, but things don't work out the way we hope. These are the moments, I believe, though, that can lead us to an even deeper, even greater hopes and dreams and experiences in our lives if we're paying attention and remaining open. Some of you have already found out that you did not get into the college you wanted to go to. Some of you are having to come to terms at the end of your high school career that maybe you're not going to play that sport again. You're not going to get into the program you were hoping for. But that might just open a door that you weren't expecting, that you're going to be able to walk through, that's going to take you somewhere that you could never even imagine. That's going to be so much better than what you thought you wanted. Mr. Smith, thank you so much for sharing that encouraging message. I hope if you've learned one thing from Mr. Smith today, it's that you need to live and tell your own story and listen deeply to the stories of others. To be kind to one another, to love one another, to be courageous enough to listen to the experiences of others, and bold enough to be a part of shaping the stories of others. Your life matters, your story matters. So live it and tell it. Let's give it up for Mr. Smith one more time.